Now, we have a problem with this young lady that's in New York City that seems to want to declare jihad and Islamicize America. That's unacceptable. But we're not interested in Christianizing the Middle East. We're not there on a crusade. So the question is, what the hell are we doing? And the answer is whatever Israel wants. And more Americans are figuring that out. And the problem is we're running out of options. So when you start talking about ground forces, I think the president said the 82nd, which is 10,000 paratroopers, and some portion of the Marine Corps, probably an MEF of some kind, Marine Expeditionary Force, of perhaps 10, 15,000. You're seizing something, a piece of land. And in the process of doing so, you hope to arrive with minimal damage. Then you have to stay there and protect yourself from massive incoming projectiles and missiles and so forth. You still have to feed and supply people with everything. The only island in the Persian Gulf, interestingly enough, that has a spring is Karg Island. They have fresh water. All the other islands are desert islands. They're rocks. Then you have this thing, Chabahar, on the southern coast. Well, once you land there and you take over this thing, you're going to become a target. But what does it do for you? Is it now a lily pad that's going to be used to further invade this nation of 93 million that's the size of Western Europe? Now, if you're going to say, well, we've got to win this, we're going to declare war. Okay. This means that you're going to draft into uniform millions of people. You would need at least several 100,000 troops on the ground. None of them are particularly well trained. We weren't very well trained during World War II. I mean, we have this terrible myth about the Second War that really does damage to us, where we say, well, we won the Second World War. How many times have you heard Donald Trump say that? You know, it's crazy. Well, we also had the British Empire as an ally. And even though they weren't strictly speaking an ally, we had the benefit of the Soviet military that was dying in vast numbers fighting the Germans, but in doing so, pushing the Germans back in an attrition-based war. We didn't do these things on our own, but he creates this notion that we did. And there are a lot of Americans that don't understand this was not some grand, marvelous march to victory. We took terrible losses. Now, our losses were nothing compared to what the Soviets took. And frankly speaking, you lost everything in the war. If you go back to Corelli, read his book on the decline of British power, it's clear that Churchill mortgaged everything, the empire, the nation, standard of living, wealth, everything, to winning this war against the Germans, even though he had the Imperial General Staff telling him over and over and over again, it's not in our interest to replace the National Socialists with communists. You may want to reconsider what you're doing. It fell on deaf ears. It was too late. When he finally showed up, I think it was in early March of 1945, and told Eisenhower, you know, it would be terribly useful if we controlled Berlin, Prague, and Vienna when the war ended. Really, those are parts of Western civilization. We have to have those. Eisenhower looked at him, what are you, crazy? You know, we had just lost, a couple of 100,000 casualties fighting our way through Belgium and Luxembourg. How do you want us to do this? Are we going to then take on the Soviets? And we glorify Patton for many reasons, some good, some bad. But we don't know that when he spoke to all the troops at the end of World War II and said, gosh, I really wish I could go with you because you're going to go to the Pacific and have the opportunity to kill Japanese. He was booed off the stage. He had divisions rebel. They refused to go. People don't get it. They don't understand it. They didn't live through it. Most of their families were never in it. Everybody had it. When we dropped the atom bomb, whether or not we should have, that's another discussion, but my father was in Okinawa. And he said people cheered everywhere. You know, let's go home. Nobody wanted to keep fighting. Everybody had it. Now, we're not a Soviet-style totalitarian state. We're not even a Nazi authoritarian state, contrary to what the left likes everybody to believe. We're a relatively free country. We're a republic. We don't do these things very well. you know, we have been fighting these imperial wars on the cheap, following the British model. We've finally bitten off something we can't easily subdue, but no one wants to admit that.
And young Americans are not exactly going to be willing to kind of line up to fight in the unlikely event that you went for full conscription, right? Much like we're seeing in Ukraine with the bussification. Young people just don't want to fight. I
think most of these Americans, if you told them we're guarding the Mexican border and we're going to defend the United States against the drug cartels, and we're going to stop the movement of millions of people into our country that we didn't invite, who are not people we want, I think they would support that without hesitation. In fact, I've asked people those questions whenever I travel and I speak to audiences. Everybody is 100% for defending the United States, but they don't see any evidence that we're defending the United States. And they're right. We're not.
Yeah. Well, what's absolutely clear to me is that Trump almost psychologically has no way out of this, just because of the nature of his personality and the fact that he's making a lot of money from it as well, as are his friends. He's just so narcissistic, it seems to me, that he needs approval at every step. And, well, I said right at the start of the conflict back in February that, if Trump finishes it quickly, he looks weak. And if he goes on longer, he looks incompetent. And between those 2 points, there are no good options, for him. So there's no way, it seems to me, that Trump can come out of this and spin it as any sort of a success. And that's why he can't stop. I mean, exactly the same psychological kind of trap that European leaders have got into with the war in Ukraine, because they know that when it stops, they will have failed and be seen to have failed. And I fear that that's where Trump is now, quite frankly.
Well, look, I think the difference is this. Trump can back out of this for the reasons I've already outlined. Now, is this going to hurt us with people overseas? In many cases, yes. In many cases, no. I think a lot of people in various parts of the world, depending upon how he frames this when he speaks publicly, would welcome our disengagement. And if he presents it as a disengagement for the reasons that we've outlined, at home, I think he would be supported. The last polls I've seen have been between 67 and 75% are opposed to the war in the Persian Gulf. When Eisenhower extracted us from Korea, the polling at that point was something like 55% opposed, 25% for, and the rest undecided. And he simply said, no, we're not going to do this. And he went to Korea and he received a briefing from General Mark Clark. And I'm sure you know who he was. He commanded in Italy. He has a mixed record with the American people and in military history, but be that as it may, he was in command and he did his homework and he said, we will have to put 800,000 men on the ground in Korea if we are to drive the Chinese out. And ultimately, it would make no sense to drive them out unless we march all the way to Beijing. All right. And Eisenhower looked and he walked out of that and he turned to his military assistant, who is a General Goodpaster. And he said, this is outrageous. The American people won't support this. They have no interest in this. He said, we've got to end this. The Mark Clark was very bitter, but Eisenhower was right. What are we doing here? We don't need to be here. This is not life or death for us. And so what do? We restored the status quo ante, and it's held. And the big challenge right now is, in my judgment, is to get out of the place without starting another war. And I think that will happen, because one of the lessons that's being learned by many, many people around the world is that we no longer have the power or the capability to protect them the way we did in the past. And so once he leaves the Middle East, which is what's going to happen, we are going to leave. I think people in Northeast Asia are going to say, well, then why are these Americans here? They can't really protect us anyway. And that's true. And oh, by the way, there was a time when Donald Trump thought they should protect themselves. And he was right. And we keep sort of insisting that every single potential opponent or competitor is some manifestation of Hitler or Stalin. You know, the supposition that, well, China desperately wants in there. No, China doesn't want to go into any of these places. China wants to make money. China is interested in bankrolling itself. It's interested in preserving itself. I mean, they've been through plenty of wars. They're not interested in war. The Chinese would welcome our departure because, to be frank with you, if they have to make a choice between Crazy Kim in the north and the people in the Republic, guess who wins? The people in the Republic. And at that point, the Russians, who are really the only backers for President Kim, I mean, the Chinese are reluctantly there. He's going to be told, look, thanks for all your interest, but we don't want a war on the peninsula. Japanese don't want a war on the peninsula. So the idea, if we leave, then the whole world collapses, is just not true. And the world, particularly in Northeast Asia, is far more rational than we think, more rational than we are. So that brings us back to the Middle East. What happens? Well, I'm sure you're going to see the Turks and the Iranians emerge as the preeminent powers. The real question is, how does this artificial construct called Israel survive? And I don't have an easy answer. And that was my concern when this whole thing began, because I told my friends in Israel, I don't think Israel can survive this. And they said, just you watch.
Well, it can if it chooses to coexist peacefully, but the question is whether it can make that choice. And evidence so far suggests that it cannot make that choice because people are too invested in the whole kind of settler movement, the West Bank, and now Syria, Lebanon, picking fights with Turkey. There's not a lot of evidence that the Israelis are kind of bought into this idea of just living peacefully with their neighbors, quite frankly, from what I see. Or do you see it differently? I mean, I can see very little evidence, frankly, of that.
How do you turn to the people that live around you that you have called subhuman, unworthy of life, and suddenly say, well, listen, let's sit down and talk? What reason is there for them to believe in anything you say? Now, maybe under the right financial conditions, the people that are running the show in the Arabian Peninsula will sell their people out again. That's possible. Although I'm beginning to hear a lot of rumblings in the Arabian Peninsula along the lines of getting rid of their elites, because the elites are held responsible for the terrible debacle that they confront right now. But when it comes to Turkey and to Persia, no. That's an entirely different set of circumstances. My concern is that with this Mr. Netanyahu coming to the funeral, that we're going to go into another round of escalatory action, that we are going to double down on failure. And I think we're going to probably experiment with some plan to go into Chabahar or wherever it may be, Karg Island. And maybe somebody is saying, well, listen, boss, if we can get in there and take this and put up the flag, we can say victory, and then maybe we can leave. Good God, I don't know.
Sort of Iwo Jima moment, but more catastrophic. All very kind of troubling. And it seems to me that the world is kind of radicalizing against US, particularly in the developing world, right now. And this is only going to be a benefit for China as it kind of develops its diplomatic relationships with the developing world. I mean, for what it's worth, I see some sort of normalization across the Islamic world, both to the east and the west of the Persian Gulf, as the ultimate corollary of this, where the Islamic world comes together in a more unified way on the back of an era in which kind of American and British and Israeli interference has actually almost insisted on division between, the Persians on the one side of the Gulf and the Arabians on the other side of the Gulf. I mean, that's how I see this kind of evolving. What happens to Israel? I don't know, except that actually they need to kind of find a way to kind of live peacefully, but I'm not sure they're capable of doing that. But in the short term, the prognosis is not very good.
Well, I suspect the Chinese will enable the kind of thing that you're describing, because BRICS is increasingly growing in strength. More countries are joining it. It's going to become more attractive because, frankly, We've weaponized all the institutions, financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF and so forth. And they're going to say, look, we're renouncing our debt. We're going to nationalize this and the next thing. And they'll just join BRICS. And the Chinese and the Russians and India, everybody that's in BRICS, they'll say, join us, forget them. You don't need them. The hell with them. We keep talking about the debt trap that we claim China is trying to create. In reality, we're the masters of it. We force people into terrible debt. And then we've always tied it to this condition, well, you've got to be like us. You have to mimic us in terms of your political structure. That's a losing proposition. You know, before we go, I had just taken a few minutes to go back and read some of the transcripts from discussions between Harold Macmillan and JFK. And I was interested in the Cuban Missile Crisis because at that point, JFK leaned very heavily on Harold Macmillan for advice. And I thought Macmillan's advice was excellent. And Macmillan subsequently also told him when he approached him, he said, well, we'd like you, if in the future, to join us in what we think will be a war in Vietnam against communism. And he said, not on your life. We're not going to do that. And of course, he pointed out, you just chased us out of several places. Now you want us to go back in. What happened to the Harold Macmillan School of British foreign policy? He seems to me to have been an eminently reasonable man who never lost sight of what was in the interest of the British people. Now, he may not have been perfect domestically. I mean, after all, he was from the upper class, and that's the problem for lots of people in Britain to understand that. But he steered Britain away from some terrible things. And then, of course, he lost office, which was unfortunate. But anyway, what do you think about that? Does anybody ever talk in those terms? Do they even remember the man?
Well, yeah, I remember him, of course. I mean, it's before my time before I was born, but of course I remember the history of that. But I mean, you actually put the finger right on it when you said we want people to be just like us. You know, we've lost the ability to kind of think rationally about foreign policy. That's the problem. We think emotionally about foreign policy. We want to kind of impose our values. We won't actually trade. We won't have political relationships with other countries if they don't share the same values as we have. I mean, I can walk down my street and find people with different values to mine, but still we can get along with each other. That's entirely fine. We've lost, as you say, we've lost sight of what are core strategic interests. And I say all the time that actually every country has three core strategic interests: to keep their border safe, to keep their people safe, and to provide for prosperity for the nation. And that nothing else. You know, we want people to kind of have our values is utterly irrelevant. And yet we've become a hostage to this kind of values-based normative foreign policy, which is selling us out and leading us down rabbit holes like the war in Ukraine. You know, we don't like Russia. Is it liking Russia or not liking Russia is irrelevant? You know, how can we actually, have a relationship where our security, our prosperity, is, and our people are safe? And, you take energy security, for example. A rational foreign policy would say, well, it makes sense for us to have cheap energy from Russia just because that helps us. But people can no longer think in those terms because Putin's a demon. He may well be a demon, he may not be a demon, but that's irrelevant to the consideration of a rational kind of foreign policy. And until we can get back to that, and I completely subscribe to that school of foreign policy, very few people in the UK do these days, and I worry that kind of not that many in the United States do either. We will be doomed to kind of Kool-Aid drinking, true believing leaders who just want to change the world in their kind of diminished image. I'm afraid that is my assessment.
No, I think you're probably right. Well, the difference, of course, is that most Americans on any given day are not really interested in what's happening overseas. They just aren't. And that means the field is left to the people who have agendas. And those agendas are antithetical to the interests of the American people.
Exactly right. And it's exactly right. And we we layer them onto our foreign policies as if the other countries would find them remotely relevant or interesting. And of course they don't. And of course, in many cases, the countries find them antithetical to their way of life as well, which only causes, greater friction. So, completely right. Most people just don't care. As you say, they just don't care. They want their kids to be safe. They want to have food on the table. They want a good job. They want to kind of feel they have a purpose in life within their country. And actually, okay, go on holidays, meet people from other countries. That's fine too. Get along well with them, not have wars, and that sort of thing. Most people just don't care about these foreign wars. And that's why we should kind of, get rid of people who insist on taking us down these ridiculous kind of foreign policy traps that we seem to find ourselves in, repeatedly through history since the end of the Second World War. But that's a rather dark way to end it.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I might just give my Substack a quick plug for you.
Please do.
If you go on to it, it's called Macgregor Warrior Diplomacy. And a new piece is going to show up by Friday. It's called Trump's War to the Last Missile, where I go into some detail about what we were discussing, the futility of this employing ground forces, the futility of renewing bombing and so forth, but also point to something that very few people are aware of, and that is that we're not really at war, and we cannot ramp up our industrial base to produce enough missiles and unmanned systems within the requisite time desired and in the quantities needed to defeat Iran. We just can't do it. And people say, well, this is outrageous. We should be able to defeat Iran. Well, wait a minute. You only maintain military power as a hedge, really, strategic hedge against the possibility that you may be compelled to fight. I mean, that used to be the theory. Well, if we have to fight, well, we'll have enough that we can protect ourselves while we then swing into action, mobilize the country, and so forth. And I go into some detail on that I think may be of interest to your readers, and then go through some of the more serious mistakes that we made since Trump took office. Mistake number one, I think, was not getting involved to bring this war in Ukraine to an end, telling the European allies this needs to end, it's in no one's interest, and then cutting off the Ukrainians and saying, look, either you sit down and accept a framework for discussion, or we're out, because we're not going to bankroll your war in perpetuity. That's mistake number one. He could have done that. And there was still a lot of goodwill in Moscow towards us. That's almost all gone now. I think they've figured out, he's the yo-yo. Don't believe anything he says. It's a waste of time. And I think the second thing was, of course, deciding to go to war under pressure from the Jewish lobby without really understanding what you were walking into, with catastrophic outcomes. And then finally, the other point is this tariff war on China, which we can't win and did not win. We lost it. It harmed us. And we could have found better ways to go forward. If you take those three things and you look at what we want to do now in the hopes that we can rectify the mess in the Gulf, you can't do it. You need to walk away from it. You need to change direction. But, Ian, as you know, making profound change is a difficult thing in any structure, but for a republic, especially when people have made outrageous statements from which they cannot retreat, becomes almost impossible.
Well, that's why we need more diplomats, because diplomats avoid making outrageous statements they can't go withdraw from, and we need more people who speak in measured terms. Frankly, as statespeople, our leaders, and everybody's playing to the media gallery. They're not, one of the core problems we have with diplomacy, although I think we've largely abandoned diplomacy, is our fixation on, talking to the lobby, not talking to the people we most need to talk to, and that's our adversaries. This belief that we could just not talk to Putin and that will be okay, because he's not nice, he says hurty things, will prove with history to be a catastrophic mistake, because we're losing and will be seen to have lost. And diplomacy is not about liking people. It's about getting, coexisting and finding a way not to kill each other, basically. And we've kind of catastrophically lost sight of that, I'm afraid to say. But here's to more moderation.
Well, tell everybody else I missed them. I thought I might see Jeremy here today. He's
Steve and Polly. Yeah, we just had a message yesterday. We're just chatting. We should get another kind of four-way going again. That's a lot of fun, actually, when we did that. But yeah, we talk every day. We have a little WhatsApp discussion group, the three of us. So yeah, no, I'll pass on your good regards. Thank you very much for thinking of them. And thank you for joining today. I really appreciate your time. Incredibly busy you are. I like Water the Last Missile. I may even use that as the heading in my video and actually put a link to your Substack in the description box as well, so that people can read that. And I shall read that immediately after we finish this call. So thanks again, Doug. I really appreciate your time today.
Okay. Thank you, Ian.